Well, first of all, welcome to the Jalsa Salana 2017. And I understand that this portion of the event is sponsored by the Review of Religions that you may notice on my hat. And of course, this is my third Jalsa in a row. I was here the first time in 2015, then 2016, and now I'm back for my third Jalsa, and I'm thrilled to be here as always. And today, it is my privilege to be able to introduce our first speaker, and I do believe we'll be able to actually introduce our first speaker now. I am honored to stand here and introduce to you Bruno Barberis of Turin, Italy, formerly the president of the Centro of Turin, now the vice president of the Confraternity. Did I get it right, Bruno? Thank you. Bruno is one of the most important shroud scholars in the world, certainly one of the preeminent scholars from Italy, and so it is my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Bruno Barberis. I think you need all three.
First of all, I want to thank the organization of Jalsa Salana, because for me it's a big honor to be here together with you, and for speaking about this very important project, which is the Shroud of Turin. Yes, but now there is a little long. And I thank also my dear friend Barry for his presentation, and we can begin with a brief video which which organize for you a travel into the shroud in order to understand which is, and in particular, the meaning of its image.
By now, throughout the world, the term shroud refers to a living cloth, 4 meters 42 centimeters in length, 1 meter 13 centimeters in width, which has been kept in Turin since 1578. On this light yellow ochre sheet, there are visible imprints that reproduce the frontal image, left, and dorsal image, right, of a human body. There also appear numerous other marks left by the vicissitudes suffered by the shroud during its life. The frontal image shows the face crowned by long hair and a thick beard, the thorax, the arms crossed over the pubic area, and the legs stretched out. The posterior image shows the nape of the neck, the back, the outstretched legs, and the soles of the feet. In particular, one notes 2 black lines running parallel to the longer side, burn marks caused by a fire that broke out in 1532 in Sainte-Chapelle at Chambéry, then housing the shroud, folded in a silver box. The 2 black singed lines are due to contact with the overheated sides of the box. During the fire, a drop of molten metal fell onto the sheet, passing through every layer, destroying the fabric. This explains the symmetrical repetition of numerous triangular holes along the 2 black lines. In 1534, These holes were repaired by the Clare nuns of Chambéry, who covered them with patches. In addition to reinforce the area of the sheet damaged by the fire, the sisters sewed both the shroud and the patches to a sheet of linen called Holland cloth. For conservation reasons, these patches were removed in 2002, and the Holland cloth substituted by a new backing fabric, recognizable under the burns because of its different color and weft with respect to the shroud. In the central area of the sheet, there are a series of large rhomboidal marks with jagged edges. These were caused by the water that soaked the shroud at some time in its history. Also 4 symmetrical groups of brownish burn marks, smaller than the former, which, without doubt, date from before the Chambéry fire. In this case, too, the new backing cloth appears beneath the holes, recognizable by its different color and weft. An 8-centimeter wide strip of the same material as the shroud has been sewn on. Its extreme edges have 2 large gaps, under which the new fabric can be seen. Along the lower edge of the left-hand gap, there is the area from which the 2 most recent material samples were taken for scientific purposes in 1973 and 1988. The shroud fabric consists of a valuable linen that appears to be hand-woven with a characteristic typical of herringbone cloth. The longitudinal strips, about 1 centimeter wide, are highly visible when the cloth is illuminated with close-up light. Upon enlargement, the herringbone weave is clearly visible. The man of the shroud bears numerous bruised lesions that coroners have carefully studied. Swellings have been identified that appear coherent with hematoma. These are particularly visible on the right side of the face, which is more swollen than the left. Furthermore, there are marks attributable to lacerated and contused wounds. The nasal septum is bent, caused by a fracture. All things considered, the man of the shroud appears to have been savagely beaten during the hours preceding his death. On the forehead, nape of the neck, and in the hair, one can observe numerous sinuous rivulets of blood originating from wounds caused by pointed objects with a small diameter. They radiate out from the head and appear to have been caused by a crown of sharp thorns placed on the head itself. The characteristics of the blood traces leaving the wounds allow the distinction between lesions involving arterial and venal vessels. Of particular interest is the blood stain in the center of the forehead, coming from a wound to a frontal vein that has the form of an upturned V, because it follows the lines of the forehead itself. On the right-hand side of the chest, there is a large blood stain originating from an oval wound caused by a pointed cutting object that struck between the 5th and 6th rib and penetrated deeply. The characteristics of this wound are important in that they show that it was inflicted after the death of the subject. The blood that spurted out of the wound is surrounded by a serous halo that is typical of blood flowing out of a corpse, in which the serum and corpuscles have already separated. The frontal image of the shroud shows clear signs of the imprints left by the arms. These are stretched out with the hands crossed in the pubic region. On both forearms, there are long blood stains beginning at the wrist and flowing up to the elbow. Their direction appears unnatural, as they seem to be flowing upwards. One must bear in mind that we are dealing with bloodstains formed when the body was hanging on the cross and the wrists were higher than the elbows. The left wrist shows clear signs of a characteristic blood stain formed by two diverging trails of blood related to the two different positions assumed by the condemned on the cross, the prostrate and the erect. The blood flows out of an oval wound caused by a pointed instrument such as a nail. The location of this wound is of particular interest, not being on the palm of the hand, as depicted in traditional iconographic representations of the crucifixion, but on the wrist. Of particular interest is the absence of thumbs on the image of the shroud, and this could have been caused by either the lesion of the median nerve or a tetanic contraction. Excoriated round and linked bruises, about 2 centimeters in length, that are also visible on the lower limbs. These appear to be lesions caused by the flagrum, a Roman torture instrument consisting of a wooden handle and thongs, at the end of which were attached 2 small dumbbell pieces of lead. It is difficult to establish the number of flagrum blows inflicted because we do not know the number of thongs on the flagrum. What we do know is that the torture was inflicted on a bent back with the body naked. At the height of the left scapular region and above the right shoulder, one can observe quadrangular bruises related to the marks left by a rough, heavy object that can be identified as the patibulum, the horizontal axis of the cross the condemned sometimes carried to the place of execution. Finally, at the height of the kidneys, one observes a transversal blood flow that crosses the whole back. This is the blood spurting from the rib wound when the body, once removed from the cross, is laid in a horizontal position. The lower limbs of the man of the shroud are easily discernible, both in the anterior and posterior images. Both knees show abrasion, very probably caused by falls, because in these areas, as on the soles of the feet, traces of soil have been identified. It is also worth noting that the left knee has been fixed by rigor mortis in a more bent position than the right one, and, as a result, the left leg appears shorter than the right one. The sole of the right foot is clearly imprinted, while the left one has only the posterior part near the heel visible. This suggests that the crucifixion took place using only one nail, and by placing the left foot on top of the right. On the sole of the latter, one notes the exit hole of the nail, from which depart the rivulets of blood descending towards the toes. Corporeal imprints that one sees on the shroud are dark in the relief areas, while light in the others. The image, therefore, has a light distribution opposite to that which we actually see. The imprint, therefore, appears to be the same as a photographic negative. By changing the image of the shroud into its photographic negative, light and shade are obviously inverted, and this, therefore, shows the true aspect of the man of the shroud, as we would observe were he in front of us.
Well, according to tradition, the Holy Shroud is the burial cloth in which Jesus of Nazareth was wrapped after he was taken down from the cross. This corresponds to the accounts written in the Gospels which describe how Joseph of Arimathea arranged the body of Jesus in the tomb after wrapping it in a shroud. This tradition matches the historical vicissitudes of the shroud, although its documentation can only be considered certain and complete from the mid-14th century onwards. The shroud has been kept in Turin, in the northwest part of Italy, since September 14, 1578, when it arrived from Chambéry, France. 20 years later, in 1598, the Confraternity of the Holy Shroud was founded in Turin. Still nowadays, this association, together with the International Center of Sindonology, carries out the important task of promoting research, knowledge, and the cult of the shroud throughout the world. The shroud has always aroused interest, but the first photograph of it gave an entirely new direction to all studies on the subject and made the shroud known all over the world. During the public exposition of the shroud of 1898, with this camera, the Turin lawyer Secondo Pia photographed the shroud for the first time. As you can see, it's not pocketable, and also it's not digital. Pia himself told of how he nearly dropped the large glass negative plate customary for the photography of the time, when on the photographic negative he saw the positive figure of a man emerging for the first time visible in natural contrast, with lifelike highlights and shadows as on a real photograph. He understood that the imprint on the shroud therefore behaves like a naturally negative image, with the exception of the blood stains and the marks of the wounds. In other words, in the image of the shroud, except for the blood stains and the wound marks, light is distributed in an opposite way to what we perceive in reality. Therefore, it behaves like a negative photograph. By reversing such distribution on the negative photography plate, we can see on the negative photograph the real image of the man of the shroud, just as if he was standing in front of us. This first photograph marked the beginning of the modern scientific studies on the shroud that were to develop later on to include all branches of science and research. Especially in the second half of the last century, the scientific research on the shroud was characterized by the founding all over the world of groups and centers devoted to study and research. A very important role is played by the International Center of Sindonology of Turin, founded in 1959, which has the task of promoting, coordinating, and developing studies and research on the shroud, and of assuring any scientific, technical, and organizational advice to the papal custodian of the Holy Shroud, that is, the Archbishop of Turin. The shroud is approximately 4.40 meters long and 1.13 meters wide. The fabric is linen, spun with a Z twist, and woven in a 3-to-1 herringbone twill. It was woven on a primitive loom, and the technique is often irregular. As the video showed, the traces imprinted on the shroud are of 4 basic types. Fire marks on the fabric, the 2 dark parallel lines of scorches running along its entire length, intersected by 22 roughly triangular holes due to the fire that broke out in 1532 in the Saint-Chapelle Chambéry. Water stains, probably due to water used to put out the fire of Chambéry or in some other occasion. The chiaroscuro image front and back of a full-size human figure. Blood stains, which are present in particular places such as the forehead, the neck, the wrist, the feet, and the chest. Since 1932, forensic pathologists pointed out that the several wounds visible on the image left by the body of the man of the shroud prove beyond doubt that the image was left by the corpse of a man who has endured prolonged torture. He was struck on the face, he was given a crown of thorns, he was whipped on the back, he carried a heavy beam on his shoulders, he was crucified with 3 nails, he died on the cross due to asphyxia. After that, he was pierced by a spear on the chest. After that, he was wrapped in a sheet. Therefore, this is undoubtedly the image left by the corpse of a tortured and crucified man. Now we pass to examine the modern scientific research on the shroud. The double image of the shroud was imprinted by a corpse that left no traces of decomposition. The body, therefore, remained wrapped in the shroud long enough for the image to form, but not so long as to register any decomposition of the corpse, which would have a deleterious effect on the image. Moreover, the body was separated from the cloth without deforming, inexplicably, the clots of blood. Many theories have been put forward by scientists in order to explain how the image was formed. Usually a corpse leaves no traces on a cloth. But until now, there have been no satisfactory experimental results which are really comparable with the shroud image, and some of its characteristics are not reproducible even today. However, chemical and physical studies carried out in recent years on the image permit us to state without doubt that the shroud image is not a painting or any other type of work by human hand. In 1978, a group of 44 scientists, among them the American group STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, and about this team, Barry Schwartz will speak tomorrow in detail. This group of scientists made a deep and complete data collection on the shroud, and in 1981, after an exhaustive study and evaluation of the data, stated as follows: no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils of the shroud image. X-ray, fluorescence, and microchemistry on the fibrils preclude the possibility of paint being used as a method of creating the image. Ultraviolet and infrared evaluation confirm these studies. Microchemical evaluation has indicated no evidence for any spices, oils, or any biochemicals known to be produced by the body in life or in death. It is clear that there has been a direct contact of the shroud with a body, which explains certain features such as scourge marks as well as the blood. The scientific consensus is that the image was produced by something which resulted in oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the polysaccharide structure of the microfibrils of the linen itself. However, there are no chemical or physical methods known today which can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. Thus, the answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now, as it has in the past, a mystery. In this picture, we can see the magnification at the optical microscope of a blood area. The traces of blood are clearly visible. Moreover, they penetrated in the cloth because the blood is a fluid, and therefore they are clearly visible also on the back of the shroud. The microscopic examination of the areas bearing instead the body image, this one, reveals that it is due to a change in color, a yellowing, of the surface fibers of the linen threads that constitute it. The fibers constituting the wires are colored in yellow only if they are located, or if they were originally, on top of the wire. In the areas of intersection where the thread passes under the other, there are no significant staining. This observation highlights the extreme superficiality of the image, of the order of micrometer, that is 1/1000th of a millimeter. In fact, the image is not visible at all on the back of the shroud. Here is possible to see up the front of the shroud and down the back of the shroud, where the blood stains are clearly visible, while the image is not visible, a confirmation of its superficiality. The changes in the intensity of color are not related to the degree of yellowing of the individual fibers, but to the number of fibers per unit area yellowed. Moreover, the body image is absent below the blood stains, where the blood is, there is no more because probably it was loosed during the centuries. The fibers are not yellow but white. Some tests carried out on some threads taken in 1978 from the so-called blood areas of the shroud, made in Italy by Pierluigi Bollone and in the USA by John Heller and Alan Adler, lead to show that the so-called blood stains are composed of hemoglobin, and also give a positive test for serum albumin. Moreover, it has the characteristics of human blood of the AB group. In 1973 and again in 1978, the late Swiss criminologist and biologist Max Frey-Sulzer identified 58 varieties of pollen grains on the shroud. He stated that the plants of pollen grains of which he found on the shroud are typical of, and at times are exclusive to, the regions through which the shroud is historically supposed to have passed, that is in particular Palestine and Anatolia. In 1977, the American scientists John Jackson and Eric Jumper of STURP Group processed a computer image enhancement and analysis of the negative image of the shroud by a device known as a VP8 image analyzer, showing that the image has unique three-dimensional information encoded in it, a feature which is possessed neither by paintings nor by normal photographs. In 1978, the Turin scientist Giovanni Tamburelli obtained independently from his American colleagues high-definition three-dimensional images, which highlighted numerous details not otherwise visible. One of them is the imprint probably produced by a coin on the right eye, which seems to fit a lepton of the first years of the Christian period. Subsequently, Tamburelli, in collaboration with Nello Balossino, managed the process image of the face, cleaning off the wounds and blood flows to obtain the real face of the man of the shroud before the torture. At last, in 89, Tamburelli and Balossino, by means of a specific mathematical procedure, made a computer comparison between the three-dimensional clean image of the face of the man of the shroud and some famous icons depicting of the face of Christ after the 6th century. The very high number of common points found on the examined images show that there is a very high probability that the face of the man of the shroud was the prototype that inspired Christian iconography, at least since the 6th century. In 1988, 3 samples of fabric were taken from the top left-hand corner of the shroud and were submitted for radiocarbon dating. The result obtained by the 3 laboratories entrusted with the test, Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson, dates the shroud between 1260 and 1390 AD. The following years saw lively polemics and broad articulated debate among experts on the trustworthiness of radiocarbon dating and the result obtained in the 3 research laboratories. For several aspects, the medieval result is incompatible with many results previously obtained in other fields of research. Moreover, it's very difficult to ascertain whether no extra C14 was added later on to the quantity of C14 present at the moment of harvesting the linen used to weave the shroud. This hypothesis cannot be discarded if the troubled history of the shroud is taken into account. Experimental research made in several laboratories in the world on ancient fabrics, not only on the shroud, appear to demonstrate that biological and chemical pollution are able to considerably alter the radiocarbon age of a cloth. The shroud has certainly been polluted both by biological contamination, as shown by the biological microtraces found on it, and by chemical contamination. For example, during the fire of Chambéry, it was subjected to a carbon-rich atmosphere and to a high temperature. For these reasons, the above discussed theoretical and experimental results available so far must be critically examined, checked, and compared before any sufficiently reliable conclusions may be drawn. Hence, the problem of dating the cloth of the shroud is at this moment open and not yet solved. About this argument in the next lecture, my friend David Rolfe will examine on wide aspects this problem and this research. An interesting recent study has been carried out since 2005 at the Center of Research Enea in Frascati near Rome in Italy by a team of researchers led by Paolo Di Lazzaro. In this experiment, it was shown that a very short and intense flash of radiation in the far ultraviolet, generated for example by an excimer laser, can color a linen fabric so as to reproduce many of the peculiar characteristics of the shroud image, such as color, the extreme shallowness of staining, of the order of the micrometer, as we say, the lack of fluorescence, the absence of staining beneath the blood stains, the inverse relationship between staining intensity and the distance between the source of the film. These studies certainly do not solve the problem of identifying the way in which it can be formed imprint on the shroud, but they undoubtedly give an important contribution to improving the knowledge, since their result is without any doubt the most similar one to the shroud image that has ever been obtained experimentally. This is the summarize of the recent research on the shroud. Now, we can pass to examine the comparison between the man of the shroud, his image, and Jesus of Nazareth. Because the very difficult task is to answer the question, who was really this man? He must have been an incredible, important man, if despite being a crucifix, he was granted regular burial and was even wrapped in a precious cloth. Among the many men who have endured the crucifixion, the most famous is undoubtedly Jesus of Nazareth. Not only because Christians believe him to be the Son of God who resurrected shortly after his death, but also because his passion and crucifixion have been described in detail in the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in some apocryphal Gospels. If we compare this description of the passion, death, and burial of Jesus with the shroud features, we can see that many details coincide. This vastly justifies the secular tradition identifying the Shroud of Turin with the burial cloth used for Jesus after his death. However, it comes natural to ask ourselves if these coincidences are enough to state that the man of the shroud and Jesus actually are the same person. Some scholars thought it's possible to use probability theory to verify this hypothesis, because probability theory is that branch of mathematics concerning the calculation of the degree of confidence that can be attributed to the occurrence of a given fact. Let us examine the main characteristics common to Jesus and to the man of the shroud. 1. Both the man of the shroud and Jesus were wrapped in a cloth after death. This is a rare practice in ancient times, especially for crucified men. In most cases, the corpses were left on the crosses or at last buried in mass graves. Jesus, after crucifixion, was wrapped in a sheet acquired by Joseph of Arimathea and subsequently laid in a rock-hewn tomb. 2. Both the man of the shroud and Jesus were crowned with thorns. This feature is really exceptional. We do not possess any other document vouching for this practice, neither with the Romans nor with any other population. 3. Both the man of the shroud and Jesus carried a heavy object on their shoulder, which can be none other than the patibulum, that is the horizontal beam of the cross, which they were nailed to. 4. Both the man of the shroud and Jesus were nailed to the cross. This practice seems to be reserved for official crucifixions, while in the majority of cases the condemned were tied to the cross with ropes. 5. Both the man of the shroud and Jesus were wounded on the chest after death and do not show fractured lower limbs. This is a virtually unique feature. The widespread practice was that of breaking the man's legs in order to facilitate their death if the execution had to be speeded up. 6. Both the man of the shroud and Jesus were wrapped in their burial clothes just after their deposition from the cross, and their bodies were not previously washed or anointed. This contradicts with the time practice, where before being wrapped in a sheet, the corpses had to be washed and anointed with various perfumes. Therefore, this is an exceptional case. Evidently, external elements intervened so that the burial had to be hastened pending the definitive burial. In Jesus' case, we know that he was wrapped in a sheet and laid to rest in the tomb just after the deposition, since the whole procedure had to be completed before Jewish Passover, which forbade all kinds of manual labor. Jesus' definitive burial should have been carried out by women 2 days after his death. 7. Both the man of the shroud and Jesus were left in the shroud for a brief amount of time. The image we see on the shroud could have only been produced if the corpse was kept in it for at least 10-20 hours, but not more than 2-3 days. Otherwise, the decomposition process would have destroyed the image, and moreover, it would have left on the cloth peculiar and unmistakable stains, in particular around the face, around the nose, the mouth, which nevertheless are not visible at all on the shroud. This is truly amazing. Laying a body to rest in a shroud, an uncommon feature in ancient times, and then removing it after such short time seems completely unreasonable. Jesus too was wrapped in a sheet immediately after he was taken down from the cross, and after a period not longer than 40 hours, only the sheet was found inside the tomb, while the corpse was no longer there. In order to reach a quantitative evaluation, each one of these features was assigned a number measuring its degree of probability, which are the numbers in the column at your right, with a greater value for those that seemed common with several other crucified men, and a lower value for the rarest one that could hardly happen for any man crucified. The total probability, that is the probability of these 7 features happening at the same time or altogether for the same crucified man, is equal to the product of the single probabilities. And the total is equal to 1 to 200 billion. That is 1 divided by 200 billion. This number is almost equal to 0, which is the value which means that an event is impossible. In other words, this means that among 200 billion hypothetical crucified men, only one can possess the same 7 features shared by the man of the shroud and by Jesus. Since it is obvious that the history of mankind could never have produced 200 billion crucifixions, probably some hundreds of thousands, some millions at most. The calculation allows us to conclude that the crucified man who possesses all these 7 features is virtually unique, and that therefore the man of the shroud can only be Jesus of Nazareth. For the shroud, the last 20 years period has been marked by historical events of extraordinary importance. 4 public expositions, 98, 2000, 2010, 2015, during which a huge crowd of pilgrims came to Turin to see the shroud, several millions. 1 television exposition in 2013, the inauguration of the new premises of the Museum of the Shroud in the crypt of the Church of the Holy Shroud in Turin, which is the only public museum in the world dedicated to the precious relic. A terrible fire which destroyed the chapel of the Shroud and which threatened the Shroud's safety. And above all, the radical change in the state of the conservation of the Shroud achieved by means of a gradual, thoroughly pondered step-by-step process. Until the 17th century, the shroud had been preserved folded over several times and in different ways. From the end of the 16th century, when the shroud was definitively placed in its chapel, this is the Cathedral of Turin, this is the chapel, which is located between the cathedral and the royal palace of Turin. From that time, the shroud was no longer kept folded, but instead rolled up round a wooden cylinder and put in a precious wooden casket plated with silver and embellished with semi-precious stones in enamels, which is now on display in Turin at the Museum of the Shroud. In 1992, the then Turin Archbishop and Papal Custodian of the Holy Shroud, Cardinal Saldarini, appointed an international scientific commission composed of some of the most important experts of ancient textiles and distinguished scholars on the shroud, with the task of solving the very complex and important problem of improving the way of conservation of the shroud. After 4 years of works, the Commission provided the following suggestion for the best conservation of the shroud. First, the shroud must be laid out flat in a horizontal position. Second, the shroud must be preserved in a bulletproof airtight case in which the air must be substituted with an inert gas in order to stop the progressive darkening of the cloth due to the oxidation process, and which causes a progressive reduction in the visibility of the image. The case must be kept in a totally dark place, and its inside temperature, humidity, and pressure must be monitored. Third, it is necessary to remove the patches shown on it in 1534 to cover the hole caused by the Chambéry fire. Moreover, it is necessary to substitute the hole and cloth sewn under the shroud after the Chambéry fire. The proposal of the Commission obviously imposed the necessity to build a new and very large conservation and display case, large as the shroud. In addition, during the night between April 11th and 12th, 1907, a terrible fire almost completely destroyed the chapel of the shroud. Fortunately, in order to permit the work of the restoration in the chapel, the shroud had been transferred to the choir of the cathedral, and consequently the fire did not damage it at all. The official recognition after the fire took place the next day in Turin Archbishopric on April 14. In this picture, you can recognize the Archbishop of Turin, Professor Baima Bollone, and myself. Obviously, very much different from what I am now, because it was taken 20 years ago. Is not a little amount of time. In spite of the several difficulties and unexpected events, the construction of the case was finished on time, and on April 17, 1998, for the first time, the shroud was put into the new case, ready for the public exposition that was held to celebrate the first centenary of the first photograph of the shroud. The case was a parallelepiped, weight about 2,500 kilos. The lower and lateral surfaces were made of a double layer of ballistic steel, and the upper surface was made of thick bulletproof laminated glass. At the end of the exposition of 2000, the shroud was transferred from the huge exposition case to a new case, lighter and handier, for its ordinary conservation. Inside this art case, there is a mixture of argon and oxygen, a little quantity of oxygen, in order to guarantee the perfect conservation of the shroud and its protection from any form of aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. These graphs produced by the monitoring system show the behavior of the pressure and temperature inside the case. Finally, in 2002, the shroud was unstitched from the old Holland cloth, and afterward all the patches were unstitched as well. The polluting carbonized material found under all these patches was painstakingly vacuumed up and catalogued in opposite containers. Afterwards, the shroud was stitched to a new backing cloth. At the end of the work, the shroud was returned to its case in the left transept of Turin Cathedral, where it is protected and monitored by modern systems. This operation of improvement of the condition of conservation of the shroud is without doubt a milestone in the shroud history, because it guarantees the best possible modern condition of conservation and will permit a new generation to continue to admire this unique and fascinating image. At the end, I want to give you some words about the future research perspective. In the last 15 years, the papal custodian of the Holy Shroud has received several proposals and research projects from scientists around the world. These proposals have been collected and submitted to an international peer referee committee for a deep evaluation. At this moment, all the material arrived has been collected and arranged and sent to the Holy See. It will be the Holy See, that is the owner of the shroud, which will decide whether and when to begin new direct research on the Shroud. A new direct research campaign on the Shroud will have to have as starting point the current state of knowledge and two fundamental goals: to definitively verify the results obtained until now, and to provide objective evaluation of the various proposed hypotheses, particularly about image formations. The technique to be used must obviously be chosen among the most recent and reliable, as long as non-destructive ones. It is not an easy task to design and above all to accomplish, because it is necessary to build a modern scientific laboratory around the Shroud, with the aim to gather the largest amount of data that will then be processed and analyzed by a qualified international scientific committee. In particular, the following guidelines will have to be taken into account. 1. Any future research must take into account the research proposals advanced by the STURP scientists at the end of their studies. These proposals have been officially presented to Cardinal Balestrero, the papal custodian of the Shroud at the time, on October 1984. 2. It is fundamental and unavoidable to choose very carefully the site to examine. It is necessary to distinguish very carefully because the various types of sites, without image, with scorches, with burns, with poker holes, with water stains, with image, with blood stretches mixed. 3. In order to avoid too invasive interventions, it is absolutely necessary to use samples of very, very little dimension, and hence any taking of samples must be done only with the use of microscopic techniques. 4. With the aim of both reducing the number of samples to be taken and of maximizing the information obtained, every sample must be used to make several tests. 5. Before taking any sample from the Shroud, it is necessary to simulate on samples prepared in a laboratory all the measurements and experiments planned on the Shroud, in order to verify their feasibility, answer types, utility, and evasiveness. In conclusion, we can say that the new and fascinating challenge issued to science by the Shroud for the new millennium has already begun. Many thanks for your attention.